Hello and welcome to another episode of Acting Prime Minister with me, Paul Brand, the podcast where we pick the PM and ask a different guest each week to imagine themselves behind that Downing Street door. And this week's guest has had pretty much every job in politics apart from Prime Minister. He's been Health Secretary, Education Secretary, Home Secretary, Justice Secretary, even a minister without a portfolio. But despite running for the leadership of his party 3 times, the closest he got to number 10 was number 11 as Chancellor under John Major. Ken Clarke, welcome to Acting Prime Minister.
Thank you for having me in.
And what a career you've had, 4 decades.
Well, it's very long. I mean, the only non-controversial bit about my career is it's lasted a very long time, longer than anybody else's, my ministerial career, who's still alive, as it were. I've been a much reshuffled career, but I've had a lot of rather interesting jobs. I've enjoyed it.
And 4 decades in the Commons, how are you adjusting now to life outside it? Because since December, you've no longer been an MP.
Well, I'm not feeling a sense of shock or anything, because I planned. I said long before the election I wasn't going to stand again. I was simply on grounds of age. So it's just happened. And it's only just beginning to affect me. My diary was quite crowded, so I am going to have to start thinking about what I'm going to do now I'm retired.
I mean, we have read reports that the Prime Minister will nominate you for a peerage. I don't know whether you've had any confirmation.
Well, we will have to see what happens to that. I mean, it's the moment this government is relying on daily leaks, Downing Street sources let us know various things every morning. Really, they don't always turn out to be accurate, but we shall wait and see. Yes, I read that. So we've had all the Labour nominations have been leaked, I think, and quite a lot of the Conservative ones. So. We'll see whether I suddenly go back to Parliament again and start behaving as if I'm an MP with no constituents.
There has been a big question around it because you were sort of sacked from the parliamentary party, for want of a better expression, last year because you rebelled on Brexit. And I suppose everyone's wondering whether Downing Street has forgiven you for that and whether they're willing to show some contrition and put you in the Lords. Have you got any sense whether Downing Street's over it?
I've never been expelled from them. I'm a Conservative. I've never been expelled from the party.
No.
And losing the whip, which is what happened to me, didn't make the faintest difference to me. I just carried on as before. They forgot to tell me. I discovered through the media, but there we were, if that's what they wanted to do. And I just carried on. I am a Conservative. I carried on sitting with the Conservatives. My friends in the House of Commons, political friends, all Conservatives. And it did have a bad effect on some of the younger people. We lost 2 or 3 really outstandingly good ministers and so on who were told they couldn't stand in the election. That was the only effect of losing the whip. Well, as I wasn't going to stand in the election, for me it was totally academic. And not, as far as I'm aware, I haven't fallen out with Boris. I just don't agree with him on Europe. And I certainly haven't fallen out with the Chief Whip, who's a nice guy, and from Nottinghamshire like I am. So it was all a bit academic, really, as far as I'm concerned.
There was quite a lot of outrage about it at the time. People felt that it was an injustice.
Well, I don't think they intended to do it. We've got all these people new to politics who are trying to run everything from inside Downing Street, and I think they thought if they had to vote of confidence, everyone would vote contrary to their opinions and conscience, and they'd all obediently fall in line. I think the people who had this bright idea hadn't expected there'd be 21 people who would continue to stick to their views, and then they didn't know what to do when they got 21 rebels again. I mean, if Theresa had taken the same view, she could have taken the whip away from about 40 people who opposed her a deal, including Boris. So I don't think they'll do that again. But unfortunately, it does mean we've lost Rory Stewart, we've lost David Gauke, we've lost several very, very good people for no particularly good reason.
But have you had any dialogue with number 10? Do you get any sense of whether you're forgiven?
No, I haven't had any dialogue with number 10. No, I don't think it is a question of forgiven. The fact is, I've stuck to my lifelong views, and the views I made it quite clear at the referendum. I made it clear I don't change my opinions of national interest because of one opinion poll. I made that clear at the general election, and I voted accordingly. I accepted we were leaving. I mean, I voted against invoking Article 50. I think it's a disaster to leave the European Union for who knows what. We still don't know what. But once I found that I was in a minority in the House of Commons against a big majority that had signed up, come what may, to vote for leaving. Well, the leaving process started, and thereafter, the main thing I was anxious to do, which the rebels succeeded in doing, was stopping us leaving with no deal. This absurd idea that overnight we could suddenly leave and somehow start collecting tariffs, or somehow start paying tariffs for our European exports, somehow check all the customs papers at the border, have no arrangements on security, defence, the environment, science and research, nuclear safeguarding, all the things we do with Europe, that, on Monday we'd leave and on Tuesday we'd work out what we do now. As far as aware, we haven't even got the planning permission for the lorry parks at Dover. But there's a whole lot else we wouldn't know what would happen. And actually the rebels, we couldn't put a majority together for anything against the government, except a majority against the completely crazy idea of leaving with no deal, being the only big country in the world that hadn't got any arrangements for anything with our neighbours and had no trade deals with 27 countries in Europe and 60 other countries with whom we have EU trade deals at the moment. We stopped that.
Well, the format of this podcast is we take you from Rebel and make you Prime Minister for the next half an hour and talk a bit about what you might...
That's very nice of you. Yes,
yeah,
yes,
well, you're very welcome.
I've had a few goes at it myself in my time. I get used to being rumoured to be the next Prime Minister. We even had a mad flurry of that, which I did not take seriously, shortly before the election. But here we are, right, let's suppose I'm Prime Minister. And a Prime Minister, sadly, in this present rather bizarre situation, because we don't really know yet what any government's going to want to do.
Well, I was going to ask you about this because I've read your autobiography and there is just sort of a tinge of regret in there, a very level-headed tinge.
I would have liked to have been Prime Minister. I can't be accused of not having tried. Yeah.
Do you look back and think, what if?
Well, I don't. I'm not. I'm not sort of scarred. I mean, politics requires a lot of luck. It requires the right things to happen at the right time.
Absolutely.
So at no stage did I tell myself that I was bound to be Prime Minister, and I'd be in a pretty bad way if I'd wandered around after losing the leadership elections thinking, oh dear, what if only I had won and all that. No, it's one of those things. I've been remarkably lucky in my career. I mean, as you say, I've had an extremely full career. I've
20 years in the cabinet in total.
20 years in the cabinet, 30 years on the front bench. I've been on the front bench of the party for most of the time I was in the House. That's why I find this idea that somehow I've been thrown out of the Conservative Party. I've been a Conservative Party member for 60 years, and really I became part of the Conservative establishment at the peak of my career.
Well, let's make you Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. We've got the power to do that on this podcast. And firstly, we just ask a couple of fun questions to get you settled into Downing Street.
Well, that's what we like. I won't answer silly questions, but there we go. Yeah.
Well, they're not silly. They're more just sort of designed to get you settled into the study in Downing Street. So, firstly, what's the picture? Do you think that you'd hang on the wall? Is there a particular photo or painting?
The walls where I live are covered with political cartoons and things, 19th century ones mainly. And I have a large collection, more than I can hang on the wall, of political things for over the years. I've been in Downing Street before. In fact, where my late wife and I lived is now where the Prime Minister's, that is now the Prime Minister's flat, because Tony Blair took it over from the ex-chancellor and me and my wife. And then there was you have some very nice pictures because you can choose your own pictures from the government art collection.
Yes.
So I'm not sure what I would choose, but I would go wandering around and see what hadn't already been swiped by ambassadors around the world, put them on the wall.
And what do you think is the first drink you'd pour yourself as you got into number 10?
I drink red wine nowadays more than beer because I'm always regarded as a beer drinker. But as I get older, the volume of beer, I don't have so much. I don't drink beer so often as I used to. I probably pour myself a decent gin and tonic to start with, sort of getting down to work.
And who's the first person you'd pick up the phone to? Who would you call first, do you think?
As Prime Minister? There's no particular person I would ring up, I don't think. No, I would just wait to see who I was being proposed to have as my private office, the team of civil servants who meant to be, your team and link you with the ministers you're going to appoint. Now, I suppose if you're a new Prime Minister, first person you sit down with is your Chief Whip, because with his help you've got to put together a government. So you start with this perilous position of a reshuffle. A new Prime Minister's bound to have one, and you start, hoping people will accept the jobs you offer them, and hoping that the people who don't get the jobs they want aren't too angry. They usually turn into a shambles, as Boris discovered.
In fact, you've preempted my next question, which is that you can put together a cabinet, of course, as Prime Minister. Who among the current crop of MPs do you think has been overlooked in terms of being promoted to the cabinet? Is there someone that you think really deserves to be in the cabinet?
Well, I'm not going to start invidiously going through personalities. I think we urgently need to bring on some of the very talented younger backbenchers and middle-ranking ministers. The quality of the intake in the last few years has been remarkably high, and some have been promoted. But there are very good people on the backbenchers, one or two of whom haven't been ministers yet, who need to be brought in, because what's left of the old team of ministers is all right, but there are more able people, potentially, if you give them firstly some experience at the Parliamentary Secretary and Minister of State level, where they're very key jobs, those junior jobs, most of them. And actually, Boris has started it, but I think I would have gone further in bringing on the next generation of the leadership, because all the battles recently have left the top of the party, the senior members of the party, a bit knocked about. I've already said we've lost a lot of very good people, and rather extraordinary people have got into the cabinet, and most of them haven't lasted very long, and they keep being moved about. So I would look to the future, and obviously it's very important you get the cabinet ministers you want to work with, but bring on as quickly as possible some of the very talented younger members who've had the frustration of being backbenchers in the course of the deadlock of the last 3 or 4 years.
Let's talk as well about your path to power as Prime Minister. So your dad was a mining electrician, later a watchmaker and jeweller. You won a scholarship to the independent Nottingham High School. Then you studied law at Cambridge and became a barrister. And it was at university, I believe, that you joined the Conservative Party. What was it about your background or your upbringing that drew you towards the Conservative Party?
Well, I was mad keen on politics, so I'd got this idea in my head that I could manage it. I was going to try to become an MP, which I eventually did. It was only at university I decided, as I always joke, which party was going to have the privilege having me as a member. I was attracted by the young, modernising Conservatives, followers of Rab Butler, really. Harold Macmillan was the Prime Minister, but Ian MacLeod, who no one has heard of nowadays, was my great hero. But people like him and Maudling and Heath had lots of ideas about how to modernise Britain, because we were in a terrible situation in the 50s and 60s. We'd won a war but had no idea now what we were going to do. Our economy was a joke, and Suez had a big impact on my political views. We were still pretending we got an empire and protecting our route to India. It was a shambles. Now, the new Conservatives wanted more free market economics. They wanted to combine it with a social conscience. Modernising the country was an idea I got very much in my head when I was a very active student politician. And of course, Harold Macmillan, as part of that, made this application to join the European Community, which inspired me as well. The Labour Party just wasn't very attractive. It was rooted in the past. It was thought the Attlee era was the perfect world, but the Attlee government had been very good, but the party was dominated by the trade unions and the co-op. It stood for the status quo. The oligarchy at the top of the labour movement had no particular ideas on anything except carrying on subsidising failed industries that they nationalised and running the public services in a very bureaucratic fashion. and I found them very unappealing. So I joined the Conservatives.
And what about the Liberal Party? Because there is a very liberal strand running through your politics. You're a Europhile in an increasingly Eurosceptic party. Do you think you would have been maybe more comfortable in the Liberals and then later the Liberal Democrats?
The Liberals, they're nice people. I worked very well with them in the coalition, but it's a protest party for somebody who wants to be out of the mainstream. Over the years, it has some very nice people in, but quite a lot of eccentrics. And at local level, the Liberal Party tended in the old days to be dominated by local people who were obsessed with local issues and pavement politics and all this kind of thing. I'm not sure that I was ever attracted at any stage by the Liberals because they didn't stand for anything in particular. The nearest they came to really breaking through and forming a proper party, which actually I think if I were a left of centre politician, I would try again. Was when they joined up with the Social Democrats. The attempt to make a more modern centre-left party to replace the old Labour Party with its funny institutions and its permanent warfare with its ultra-left wing, it nearly worked. I mean, Roy Jenkins nearly succeeded. And I actually think in the recent years, I can't understand why the Social Democrat majority in the Parliamentary Party and the Liberal Democrats haven't had another go, but I think they're rather scarred by the fact that Roy didn't make it in the end.
I think with first past the post, I think they're always just a little
First past the post is a great incentive
cautious
to keep with two systems, but both the big parties, the big, strange, broad coalitions, let's face it, they're neither working well as broad coalitions now. They're both parties. Europe has divided both parties and driven them into factions, and they both tended to polarise. The Conservatives have a permanent problem with their ultra-right wing, the old imperialist wing, who became very powerful in the last 2 or 3 years, and the Labour Party have a permanent problem with their ideologue, pure left people who've taken the party over now. And even with first past the post, it's surprising that on neither side has a centre group been able to break through. In the last 10 years, it's all part of the breakup of politics in every Western democracy, which has been going on because of the pace of change, which leaves a lot of people behind in every way, and was exacerbated by the 2008-2009 crash. It's happened in every other country. You have this angry protest vote, polarised politics. You get you get the President of the United States, sort of Trump. You get Brexit. You get Marine Le Pen. You get a man called Salvini in Italy. You get Alternative for Deutschland, the far right emerging and some of that's happened in British politics. So although we've got a two-party system, the two-party systems with two parties have not been calm coalition with an agreed sense of purpose for a decade or two, really.
There's no way that you're ever going anywhere. You absolutely will be staying in the Conservative Party, I can tell that. But do you still feel at home? Do you feel as though it's a party that you recognise?
Yes, I mean, because we have this particular system, I mean, it's not wholly new that the parties are divided. I mean, they both have a history of permanent division because they're so wide. The Conservative Party runs a kind of system of absolute monarchy punctuated by regicide. It was founded by a man called Robert Peel, and he was thrown out in a revolution led by Disraeli, by his party, and overthrown. And I won't bore you with the long history of the Conservative Party, but it's full of divisions and powerful leaders being overthrown. And
but I suppose at this particular juncture in history, you're on the losing side within the party.
For the first time, yeah. The nationalist used to be the imperialist right. It's never taken over. When we joined the European Union, the party was divided on Europe. We had rebel Labour members, led by Roy Jenkins, voting for us in greater numbers than rebel Conservatives voted against joining. That was my first parliament. I was in the Whip's office arranging all this. Enoch Powell and Michael Foot were the Eurosceptics. They were against our joining. And Heath had a coalition, as it were, in votes every time we went to the division lobby between the bulk of the Conservative Party, which is one nation, internationalist, wants to modernise the country, against Enoch on our right wing, and he had to rely on Roy Jenkins defying the Labour whip with rather more people who were pro-European on our side. And that's my entire political career has had that debate.
And we've talked about this before, but you've served in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet, then John Major's cabinet, later in David Cameron's cabinet too. Who do you think was the best of those prime ministers?
Well, although I'm very friendly, a great friend of John Major's, and I'm very friendly terms still with David Cameron, I have to say I think Margaret Thatcher, objectively, was the best prime minister I ever worked with, in the sense she managed to hold power for a long time, knew exactly what she wanted to do, and made a bigger difference in reforming and modernising the country and saving it from being the sick man of Europe, the laughing stock we were when she took over. And she knew what she wanted to do, and we made a difference. I think Clement Attlee, in his way, taking on the bankrupt post-war situation, and Margaret Thatcher, in her way, taking over from the winter of discontent and the ludicrous shambles we've been in the 1970s. They were the two great prime ministers since the war, and I had the privilege of being on Margaret's front bench from beginning to end. She was difficult. I notoriously, everybody knows I called Theresa May a bloody difficult woman, but what I actually said was, to Malcolm Rifkin, my old colleague, who asked me what I thought of her, I said, well, she's a bloody difficult woman, but you and I worked for Margaret Thatcher, for God's sake. I had endless rows with Margaret. Everybody did. But all she did was promote me. And when you look back, we made a very positive difference. Crazy myths have sprung up around her. She divides opinion sharply. She wasn't a goddess, as the ultra-right now appear to believe, nor was she an evil witch, as in the mythology of the hard left. It was technology that changed the old industrial economy. It wasn't, all Margaret did was turn it into something that raised our living standards, gave us a modern economy, and prepared us to actually benefit to the full from the single market in Europe, which she took the lead in getting the Europeans to create. We became a much more powerful political country in the world, and living standards rose remarkably.
And looking at Boris Johnson, I mean, the presumption from where we're sitting right now is that he may serve for as long as Margaret Thatcher did. He may get 10 years.
Yeah, he's in an extraordinary situation. I mean, he's got the world at his feet. He can do whatever he likes. He has a comfortable majority, conformist majority now. He has no opposition. The Labour Party really loves its civil wars. It spent most of its history really more consumed with civil wars than trying to win power. And whoever wins this leadership election is still going to be fighting fringe ideological battles for years. So there's nothing, and all he needs is some policies. We have no policies on anything. All we've got is a lot of slogans, which is fine. It's nice to win an election with no policies. But there's a blank sheet of paper. He can do what he wants. Huge number of pressing problems, which we haven't done enough about in the deadlock of the last 3 years. And so I hope that what a new Prime Minister should be doing now is giving serious thought to what he wants to do and why, and what difference does he want to make. All Prime Ministers will want to be regarded as successful Prime Ministers. They get obsessed with their legacy, usually. That's the phrase that usually gets used. And you don't do that if you turn out to have a competent government that makes a significant difference in places. And you don't have popular policies. You have to do tough, difficult things. But when people see the results of the policies, do they think, well, all right, that's actually better than it used to be? That's how Margaret won. We didn't have popular policies. All our policies were opposed by the public, and we always vanished downwards in the opinion polls after every election. But after 3 or 4 years, people would say, well, things are getting better. So she kept putting her majority up every time. He could do that. this is a funny period in politics. The public are all fed up with politics at the moment, and they're not following it very closely. And and they won't until he starts doing something and makes it clear what his policy is on countless subjects.
Well, there has been quite a lot of controversy already about the way he runs his government. I mean, just this week, one of his advisors, Andrew Sabisky, has had to resign because he suggested that black people have lower IQs than white people, and that compulsory contraception could prevent creating a permanent underclass. I mean, he has now resigned. But what do you make of the fact that people like that are being hired by Number 10?
Well, prime ministers, I don't think, need this vast number of apparatchiks. All this started with Tony Blair, who started bringing these teams of people in. All prime ministers have to have their little group of close confidants and one or two special advisors. That started really in John Major's time, but we never used to have these numbers. But they're meant to be just people that the Prime Minister and the other ministers have theirs, the key one in the big departments. It's nice to have a confidant you can trust, who can try things out on, who will give you ideas, keep in touch with the gossip, work with the civil servants, tell you what's going on, and be a right-hand man. At the moment, partly because there's nothing really happening in politics, we're going through an absurd period where the press are utterly obsessed with the daily leaks from all these characters who all become leading figures in their own right. And, and I mean, frankly, this chap who mentioned, whose name I've forgotten, couldn't care less what the views are of some obscure young political apparatchik in Number 10, and his hiring and firing is irrelevant in the great picture.
No, I suppose the reason it's become an issue is because he was hired by Dominic Cummings, and there's a lot of attention at the moment about the way Dominic Cummings is running.
Dominic Cummings has got to get out of the newspapers. We've always had, let's say, there's always been a trustee, a very influential one, often alongside prime ministers. For Margaret Thatcher, it was a man called Charles Pole, and rather more prominently, a civil servant called Bernard Ingham, obviously became very much close to her as a press officer. John Major, he had a chap called Norman Blackwell. David Cameron had a very powerful figure called Ed Llewellyn, who's now our ambassador in Paris. And you couldn't meet David without meeting Ed, who I knew well because he'd done the same job for Chris Patten in Hong Kong. Now, you've never heard of any of those probably, or our audience haven't, because they weren't public figures. They weren't running the government. It always used to be regarded as an absolute disaster if the chief advisor became the story in the newspapers. Chief advisor, his boss is the Prime Minister. He's got the ear of the Prime Minister, he or she. So they're hugely influential. And they do deal with senior cabinet ministers, but not telling them what to do, but actually sounding them out and letting the Prime Minister know how things are going. This chap, Dominic Cummings, I don't know whether he loves the vast amount of publicity he's getting, but his photographs appearing in the newspapers more than the Prime Minister. And he's obviously briefing the newspapers daily about what his government is going to do. But it's not his government. And actually the things he briefs the newspapers are nonsense, because the government didn't agree with him on Hawaii. They didn't agree with him on the HS2.
Do you think he maybe has too much power then?
Well, I don't know what power he's got, but he should not have the power of the Prime Minister. He just has the ear of the Prime Minister. It's the Prime Minister who decides. And I can't see Boris becoming the creature of some Svengali, Machiavelli figure who's from puppet master who's running him. Boris may not be interested in the detail of policy, but he's not an idiot. He's a very bright man. The Cummings thing can only last if Mr. Cummings' personal appearances stop, and he vanishes and goes back to being the backroom apparatchik, which, of course, you need, and which what he's supposed to be doing. But I don't know. He's been given a caricature personality by the media. I've never met him. So if I ever met him, I'm told he's highly intelligent as well, but I have no idea whether he's the rather bizarre crackpot figure, which the newspapers like to make him out to be.
Do you think the way things are going, it's likely to implode? Because you know, a personality.
Oh, you can't go on like this. You can't govern the country and explain what you're doing to the public by the medium of leaks from an exotic aide in number 10. It will, after time, become ridiculous, and actually it will go wrong. There are plenty of bad news gaffes keep occurring now. You go back to the extremely powerful influence. It was Charles Pole under Margaret Thatcher, Jonathan Powell under Tony Blair. Their job is not to brief the newspapers and appear on the headlines every morning. Their job is to be the Prime Minister's eyes, ears, and a valuable, influential policy advisor, confidant, someone whom the Prime Minister can try out new ideas, someone who can give new ideas to the Prime Minister, if the Prime Minister will develop or not, depends how he likes them, and so on. Be the back room, power behind the scenes, which is pretty well every Prime Minister in my time has needed somebody like that. But they don't normally dress exotically and pose for the photographers before giving quite blatantly briefings all over the place about what their views are on everything.
All right, well, look, let's get back to you being Prime Minister, because after all, that is the format of this podcast. Let's just spin through a few things quickly, because I haven't wanted to interrupt the historical perspective that we're getting from you. There'd be a few things on your desk that would be very urgent. Let's just pick up one issue. Many. But let's just focus on one, which would be the reform of the BBC, which of course is a huge story at the moment in the papers, and a huge story on the BBC, because the BBC likes to talk about the BBC, and who can blame them. Would you scrap the licence fee? Do you think there's an argument for reforming it?
I would look at sensible ideas, because it's a strange tax. This is what it effectively is. I think you can cut back the extravagances of the BBC, no doubt. They've saved a lot of money already, but I would not take on the BBC. It does look as though somebody wants to take the BBC on. It's the briefings again, the off-the-record briefings, because they think the BBC's left-wing. Well, left-wingers think it's right-wing. It is, I'm glad to say, extremely balanced. It's a hugely respected institution here and abroad, extremely valuable, and it's just ludicrous. I think the British middle classes regard the BBC only slightly less than they regard the National Health Service. It's not an institution you can start taking about apart and making it go out and compete with on a smaller scale with other independent broadcasters. So I just wouldn't. I mean, you should touch it in terms of efficiency and accountability and all the rest of it. And the licence fee may be tidying up. I mean, we have this absolute joke thing that I get a free television licence.
Because you're over 75.
Hard-working young working taxpayers with bringing up children and paying their mortgage give me a free TV licence. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Gordon Brown. That was a splendid way of trying to buy votes, but I'm not going to vote Labour because you gave me a free TV licence. Thank you very,
you could point a load
very,
of things
very
about
much
that,
indeed.
Winter fuel allowance, you could argue.
Well, precisely. Gordon tried to
that.
buy my vote by giving me a tax-free cheque every winter to save me from fuel poverty. There is a lot of things like that you could tidy up. But it is true that it is as a flat rate licence on every household. You could improve it, but certainly stop giving free ones as a prize to everybody who gets into their 60s, which we seem to be on the way. The poor old BBC's been left devising the best means test they can find to help poorer pensioners, for whom there is a case for saying they'll be very lonely without it. But people like me do not need a free TV licence, thank you very much, and when being paid for by the taxation people, some of whom are not as well off as I am.
Okay, let's just finish up with a relatively quick fire round, but not too much pressure, not one-word answers, don't worry. But what's the one policy that you'd love to introduce, you think, as Prime Minister, that you never got a chance to in your career? Is there a burning issue?
Well, talking now, I think the most burning issue is to reunite the country, which is the best way of reuniting the party. So it is this question of how do you spread the benefits of this tremendously modern, high-quality economy to the whole of the population more fairly. Life is wonderful for the young, intelligent, educated, who are lucky enough to live in the right place and get the right skills. More than half the population, badly hit in 2008 by the crash, are going nowhere. 2 out of 5 people haven't got savings of more than £100 and living from week to week, and deeply angry and frustrated that all these youngsters are making fortunes in London. They believe, not every young person in London is actually, but out in the old industrial towns, the old economy's gone, nothing's replaced it. That requires not just building roads and railways, so that's quite important, but in itself that doesn't produce any revival. It helps, but that's about all. It's getting education standards in those parts of the country up to the best level of the best in the country, skills training, technical training, retraining, because most people have to retrain during their lifetimes now. The jobs change, and trying to make those places attractive for a modern economy to replace the factories, the foundries, the old coal mines, the shipyards, which have largely vanished and are not going to come back. That's the biggest single issue.
Just to finish up on some very quick questions now, which is sort of...
Yeah, I don't give short answers.
No,
I get worse
then,
as I get older.
When you're giving good, when you're answering the question, I'm not going to blame you for that. Right. Who would you rather have a deal with in the White House? Who would you rather have to deal with in the White House? Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders? Because that may well be the choice.
I would, if that is the choice, then the Western world is in a real problem of leadership still. I have no time to expand on it. I actually, I think I would certainly vote against Trump. I'd be a Democrat at this election. I would go for Bloomberg.
Okay, interesting.
There are ups and downs with Bloomberg.
Another billionaire.
But he is the credible... Well, despite that, it's not a total disqualification to be a billionaire.
Not in America, it's not. No.
Although I agree, it's a pity that we have such an untypically... It's super... He did make his money, to be fair.
True, yeah, he did, yeah.
And Bloomberg is a real-world politician of ability, and his views are not fringe and eccentric. Okay. America's as bad as we are. It's bitterly divided and polarised between populist, silly right and hard left, quasi-socialist, which is not suitable for America. Bloomberg I would go for.
Okay, and who would you most fear across the dispatch box leading the Labour Party out of those candidates, do you think?
Oh, Keir is the most capable
Keir
of them. Actually, Lisa Nandy, I think, has all the talent and is capable of emerging, although she's the most unlikely candidate at the moment because she's had no experience of leadership.
True. Although second preference votes might be
but Keir is, me as a conventional politician, the more normal politician which we've been used to until recent years, I think I am anyway, Keir is a highly competent, normal politician with sensible, normal views, though I don't agree with them, but he's left of centre, pretending to be more left-wing than he is at the moment, and I'm right of centre.
And a former barrister
not as left-wing as people think I am at the moment. I was a Thatcher minister all the way through, but Keir is a sensible choice.
Okay, says a former barrister to another former barrister.
And he's good on the dispatch box. He's a bit dull sometimes, but you wouldn't be able to get away with making silly gaffes and things over the dispatch box to Keir Starmer.
And just one fun question to finish off on. You have many famous hobbies. I've read about them all in your autobiography. But how do you think you would relax as Prime Minister? Would you keep up the bird watching and the jazz listening?
I'm too lame for my bird watching. I don't have time, and I'm getting a bit old for jazz clubs. I haven't kept up with the new arrivals in jazz. So both my hobbies, I ought to start working out how I'm going to indulge them more in my retirement. I mean, I have been obsessive about jazz, and I have been obsessive about bird watching, and I do as much of it as I can. Still, how else would I relax? I try to do a bit of travel and vanish. What I always try to do, unsuccessfully in my big jobs, alas, my family, I always try to have August completely away, vanish.
Yes, yeah.
Preferably, I'd leave behind a slightly inaccurate phone number so the office couldn't find me. sadly,
these days,
the Whitehall Treasury is so efficient, they usually found ways of working out where I was. So once or twice they haul me back, but just switch off for a month.
We miss the days before mobile phones.
Going with my family or with some mates to some exotic part of the world.
Yeah, and do you have any sense whether you're going to end up in the Lords? Do you really have no idea, no indication?
I mean, it's just like everything, it's been leaked that I'm being put forward. It certainly hasn't been cleared yet. So we have to wait and see. I've never known so many things leak, and don't think the nominations for peerages have ever leaked before, but no, we should wait to see. If I go to the Lords, well then, of course, I shall be very much tempted. I know how, I mean, I almost certainly will succumb to going back being an MP without any constituents. But, but otherwise living the life of an MP, slightly detached from the centre of power. It's not the same, but it's finding out what the other end of the palace is like.
All right, well, Ken Clarke...
All my old mates are there.
Well, we watch with interest to see if you do make your way to the Lords. Thank you so much for coming on Acting Prime Minister.
Sure, pleasure.